Eyes on Longmont, offering a diversity of topics about our community that will inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy this edition of Eyes on Longmont. Returning to the Dougherty Museum, located 1 mile south of Longmont, Doug Dougherty will continue the tour of the antique automobiles. Doug will discuss engineering features of different automobiles in the collection, such as the 1916 Packard, a 1920 Pierce Arrow, a 1924 Rolls-Royce, a 1919 Locomobile, plus others like the 1928 Studebaker. Doug will also talk about the history of some of these cars, since many were local to the Longmont area.
Ike, we moved over to another car here. This is also a Lozier. This one's a 1913 model, while the other one was 1910. They made quite a few changes. The bore and stroke of the engines are still the same, but they've made quite a few improvements internally in the motors. This is called the Riverside Touring, 7-passenger Touring. So this was the biggest model they made. They have 2 little fold-down jump seats here in the back for smaller persons, children, but it gave you the capacity of 7 passengers or more, depending on how many you get in the big back seat. It was quite roomy. This car is quite original yet. This is all original side leather here. The floor mat's worn, but that's original. And the original leather is under these seat covers. We were using the car quite a bit, and it's starting to crack and wear the leathers, and we saw a picture taken from the factory that they put seat covers on, one right out of the factory. So we copied that pattern and top boot, and continued to use the car with the original leathers underneath.
So you told me this car was originally, came down to the collection from Montana?
It did. It was in a collection in Miles City, Montana. I think we acquired it about 1961. And it's been one of our favorites ever since.
I can see why.
Good touring car. Been up Pikes Peak a couple of times, Mount Evans, Trail Ridge numerous times, and several of the national tours. Reno tour again twice or 3 times, I believe. So it's been around, and I've got a lot of enjoyment out of it. It's all the whole family, and it's a real performer also.
Right.
The engine is 554 cubic inches, 4 5/8 by 5.5 inch bore and stroke. Again, the 4-speed transmission, with 4th being overdrive, and so you don't get much use out of overdrive unless you're on the interstate or something, because you're up 60 miles an hour better before you use it. Kind of hard to believe, but some of these early cars would perform if they had the road to run those speeds on,
right,
which was rare, again. So.
Yeah, again, you had mentioned this is the first left-hand drive for the Lozier?
Yeah, this is the first year they switched from right-hand drive to left-hand drive, and center control instead of right side outside the car. And so most of the companies were switching to left by 13. And this engine has a interesting aid for starting it, being that compression, that size of motor. If you couldn't release the compression, you couldn't hardly crank them. So they had a innovative device where the entire exhaust cam will slide back about 1/2 inch and keep the exhaust valves all open, which releases the compression while you're cranking it. And as soon as it fires, you pull that back and put it back on the regular lobes, and away you go.
Okay.
You cannot crank this engine if you don't release that compression. It's just too big.
That is big.
Yeah, we can move around front here. I can show you where that is. This is the lever right here that's presently pushed in, which disengages it upon it starting to run. You just pull it out. This drops down to lock it, and you're under full normal operation. We had this car out 2 summers ago, about this time. In fact, almost overlapping these dates, they had a national tour in Colorado Springs, and 5 or 6 days. I remember the 4th fell right in the middle of the tour, so we were almost there again. So we toured the Air Force Academy and Pikes Peak and Royal Gorge, and again, just had a very enjoyable trip.
I bet it was a magnet for everybody watching.
It does draw some attention. What we moved on here now is a 1916 Franklin. Franklins were air-cooled. That's all they built. They later years built aircraft engines during the war. This car, very original car, was found in Walden. This is the original top upholstery. All that's been done is paint the car. It had about less than 10,000 miles on it. The old speedometers weren't all that dependable. They would break, so you can't say what they read is actual fact, but the car is like new, it drives like new, sounds like new. And all aluminum body, wood frame. They kept them light, but yet they were a fine quality car. The leather is very nice inside. Has a push button door release instead of a handle inside, and side curtains, of course, like most of them did. Those original curtains are still rolled up in the car. My dad took it on several trips, drove it from here to a tour in Oklahoma City. I think he did about 2,000 miles before he got home. Didn't have a bit of trouble. I'd like to show you the engine. Again, it's an inline six. I think I did mention the body's aluminum. That hood is real light, easy to lift. The air enters the front louvers and is forced down around each cylinder. There's fins cast around the bore of each individual cylinder, and the flywheel itself has fan blades cast in it, so whenever your motor's running, you're creating a draft and pulling the air through. And I rode in this car on some trips up the Big Thompson Canyon in the summertime, and we just went right up it, so they did cool.
So it seemed like every manufacturer had their own individual design improvements over other competition.
It definitely was. Everybody had their own ideas on how to build them, and improvements were coming quickly. And I'd say in the first 25 years of the car, almost any innovation was tried. It might not have been successfully developed, but automatic transmissions, push-button doors, you can go on and on. There's so many creative minds working on this that, again, some of them went into production, but like the automatic transmission is just a variance on the Model T planetary transmission. It's just everything's being done hydraulically and automatically instead of doing it with your foot. So it was a very interesting period in the development of the car. And I may have mentioned at some point my dad, one of his ideas with the collection was just kind of show that how the car developed and the different variations. And this is just one. It was the air-cooled engine.
It's really magnificent.
Car came out of Walden, I think I mentioned. It was owned by the banker up there, and he only drove it in the summertime. In the wintertime, he just put it away and put it up on blocks because of the snow and stuff in Walden in 1916. It was tough to get around anyway, I imagine. And he had a Model T if he could go for everyday use, and this was the Sunday car, hence the low mileage.
So again, was it a touring car?
Yeah, this is what you call a 5-passenger touring. It does not have the jump seats. Moving next door to the Franklin, we have a 1917 Studebaker Big Six. This was their biggest model. Again, it's a 7-passenger touring. It has 2 jump seats in the back, and if you're not needing them, they fold down and disappear into the floor, so you've got a flat floor. This car was bought locally, the John Goss family over near Hygiene. Low mileage car again, very low mileage, under 10,000 miles. Original upholstery, original top. Again, all it was done was a paint job. And I'm not sure it even got a valve job. It just still practically a new automobile. Quite a large, impressive car for the price. It was kind of mid-range, if that. But Studebaker had been around for a long time. They started out in the 1850s building wagons. So the Studebaker name has existed for, well, 150 years, I'd say, till he went out there. I think their last car was 47, something like that, maybe in the early 50s, I'm not sure. But anyway, they had been around a long time before the automobile came along. So they had coach builders and upholstery and all that came second nature to them. We toured some with this car. Locally, never took it on a big national tour because it wasn't eligible for the horseless carriage stuff because it's post-set 1915. But Dad always liked his Studebakers. So we got several more in the collection.
So it seems like once Studebaker started building cars, they jumped in wholeheartedly.
Pretty much, yeah. I think we touched on the EMF earlier. It's 1912 they bought out that company and put their name on it, and then they were in automobiles from then on. We have a 1918 Cadillac here. It's a 5-passenger touring. I just see that it had, I don't know if this is accessory or not, it's not complete, but these had glass windows in it that would fold around to break the wind for the back seat. And when we get to the Rolls Royce, I'll show you one that's intact. This is a V8. Cadillac came out with their V8s in about 1913. By 1914, I think that's all they were making. And so this is again a 1918, just a continuation of that design. It also proved pretty successful for them. They made quite a few of these cars. This car was found in Boulder. A friend of my father's saw that the wind, one of the west winds boulders on occasion will get, had collapsed the roof of an old garage, and this car was peeking out. And so my dad followed up on it naturally and found out that the original owner had left it there for many years, had not paid the storage, and the owner of the garage was more than happy to have the car moved if he would pay the past due storage bill. So that's how this car came to the collection. This was probably pre-1950. One of the features on here I was talking about a little earlier is the ease of entry. These cars, most of them were 3-door. You just had one door on the right side because the right side door was so close to the steering wheel, you couldn't really get in and out anyway. You just pull that out straight toward you. There you go. Okay. So in that case, you either had to have your lady friend get out first or you were kind of climbing over. So to try to get away from that, alleviate that problem a little bit, Cadillac came up with this innovation on the steering wheel where you can lower it down, give yourself more room to get in and out. And then once you're ready to go, you just snap it up firmly and you're back in normal position. I'm sure it was very popular with some people.
Well, I'm amazed that after all this time, it's still such a solid sounding car. I mean, and a V8, you know, it's, I can see why Cadillac made it when they came out with the V8s.
Yeah, it was a 90-degree V with porcelain headers and stuff. Very, very fine quality, very well done. And my dad liked to drive this car up and down the county roads in the early years on the county line over here in the dark. No license, of course, but he said he'd go right up to 60, no problem. That was an era when if you saw another car every hour, you were doing well. So it was a far cry from our situation today. This is a 1924 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. The Silver Ghost model was built from about 1906 to 1926 or 27. It was named after the motor. It was real quiet. They didn't hardly change that motor in that whole period. The bore and stroke and everything remained the same. Every time we drove this car, it made 14 miles to the gallon. It didn't seem to matter whether you were in the mountains or on the plains. Car came out of Denver. The Humphreys family in Denver had it. They had 3 of them in this same era of 2 years. So they had different body styles. The money was not much of an object. This car was around $14,000, which made it over 2 times the price of any comparable American car. And even at that price, this was called a Springfield Rolls, which was assembled in Springfield, Massachusetts. They shipped the components over and had an assembly plant there, assembled the cars, and that got around some import duties, I understand.
Okay.
But the price was still very high for the time. The Humphreys mansion, I believe, is now the governor's mansion in Denver. I believe I'm correct on that. Hopefully I'm right. So they were a prominent family in Denver at the time. The three cars survived. Arthur Rippey had both of them at one time, and then he since sold them many years ago. This is a 5-passenger car, dual side mounts, mounted spares, so everything's rather quick change. If you have a flat, you just pull the whole assembly off and put it on. Not unlike the modern car, but the previous cars, you had rims, you had to unbolt everything, and quite a little process to change a tire. This car has the second windshield, second dual cowl, and in a breeze wind, you fold this out and divert the wind off the back seat passengers. And it's a nice feature if it's a cold day. We never got too cold in this car. It was Dad's favorite car to drive in the wintertime. You get a lot of heat off the engine on your floorboard, on your feet, so the people in the front are quite comfortable. In the summertime, maybe a little too comfortable. And the wings here to divert the air as you wish. Vents here that open that let air come right in on your feet. And Rolls-Royce's had a cantilever spring system. You can see the rear leaf spring starts here. There's the pivot point. It runs clear to the back. So the back axle's on the back end of that big spring. And they do ride nice, very well. It's a heavy car, but it's a Rolls-Royce.
Oh, you told me an interesting story about your brother Mike and this particular car.
Oh, yeah, that brings up something. My dad, looking back, it's hard to realize how lenient he was with his sons, letting them take these cars out for different things. My brother went on some date when he was still in high school in this car. And I have to admire him for being that. He trusted us. He knew we'd run them before, knew what they were. And we got them home safe, luckily. This radiator emblem here is classic Rolls-Royce. They still use a smaller version up until recently. I don't know about currently, but I know here in the recent 20 years or so, they were still using one about half that size. I believe they call it the Spirit of Ecstasy, and that was a Rolls-Royce trademark for many years. It's also referred to as the Flying Lady, and we kind of keep close eyes on that. We don't have it on the car all the time. And I can remember on certain tours, my father would take that off at the lunch stop and put it in his pocket so that nothing happened to it while he was in the restaurant. They can be found, but it's hard and they're expensive.
And of course, this one's original to the car, isn't it?
It is. Well, since my dad got the car in 1948, it was on it then. So. And the story on that jogs my memory. It was on a used car lot on South Broadway here in Denver. And after some negotiation, he bought the car for $500 and drove it home.
Wow.
This engine is an inline six. It has dual ignition. On this side we have a distributor, and on the other side we have a magneto. And so you had to switch where you could go one or the other or both. And so it gave you a backup. If one system failed for whatever reason, you were not stuck on the road. You could run home on the other system just fine. Big carburetor. The English, I've been told, were very fuel conscious even at this time, and they did everything they could to maximize mileage. I think I mentioned a minute ago that this car made about 14 miles to the gallon every time we took it out and checked it. So for a car this big and that heavy, that was excellent mileage at the time. Not a real high performer, but steady car, 4-speed transmission, direct on fourth.
Doug, was that power steering by any chance?
No, that's just a gearbox, I guess, where the shaft comes in, and then we got the cars up on jack stands so the wheel turn easily. But we do that for two reasons. One, it takes the weight off the tire, so you don't get a flat spot in the tire. And on this car, it wouldn't matter so much, but at the early cars with the wood wheels, you can tend to get them out around if you set them in one spot too long.
Okay.
So to alleviate that risk of that happening, all the cars are up on jack stands. Here we have a 1919 Locomobile. Locomobile was one of the early pioneers in the industry around 1900, and they built gas and steam cars at the same time. I think they quit the steam about 1910, approximately. Very high quality car, high price car. This car was $8,200.
Wow.
Part of that was the custom body. Touring cars were probably in the 6,000 range. What we have here in front, these cylinder affairs were an accessory. Some were added later, some were factory construction. You can tell by the frame how they mount up, whether it was factory or later. But it's a piston running in there on a cushion of air hooked to the spring suspension, and it gave you a nice soft ride. And a lot of the higher end cars added these. I'm sure these were several $100s or more at the time, and a dollar was a dollar in those days, but still we had the car $8,200. A big drum nickel-plated headlights. This winged affair here is incorporating a motometer, which has mercury in there that tells you the temperature of the water. And if you get up here in the red, that's telling you you're probably boiling. It's time to stop and check your water and let it cool down, because it's soon going to get in trouble if you press the issue. It's kind of a neat cam design on this that lets that open and close. Again, a very fine car, 6-cylinder T-head, 4.5 by 5.5 inch in bore, slightly smaller than the Lozier by 1/8 of an inch bore, but that's all. Moving down the side of the car, I mentioned it's a custom body. Behind this sign is a little brass plate that says Ames Body Works. And you can go ahead and open that door if you'd like.
This one?
Either one. It was a cloth interior, probably almost a one-off. This is a long wheelbase car. If we get to the back, you can see that the back seat is in front of the rear axle. Nothing hangs over the back. So you can put a 7-passenger body on this car with no problem. It's a very long wheelbase, 143 inches, I believe. But there's a rumor on this car, and I need to try to run it down. It's probably just a rumor, but this might have belonged to Tom Mix at one time. And I've since learned he has a museum in California donated just to him, and I thought if I ever visited it someday, I might see a photo with this car in it. That would be nice to confirm that. But these famous people owning certain cars are something I always take with a grain of salt, unless you can really prove it, because there's a lot of those cases around where that isn't the case.
Right. Now, with this wood trim, was that a popular feature back in the day?
Yeah, a lot of cars had some exposed wood. Not a lot, but it was, again, a custom body, and put on the car after it was made. And I assume it went to the body works after the factory finished the chassis. In the back, I'll open that up. You have little vases here for your roses or whatever. And we've used this car in a couple of weddings, one for my nephew and actually one for my wedding. So the ladies on the day of the wedding getting to the reception don't want their hair mussed. They've worked hard on that, so the closed cars are very popular versus the Lozier out in the wind. So that was one of the reasons we used this car. Plus, it's a very nice car to boot. So the government bought a number of these during World War I. In fact, this little article here is about the special car they built for General Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, who was the American general in charge of the Expeditionary Force, I believe they called it, that went to Europe toward the end of World War I and brought the war to conclusion. That car, the last I heard, was in the Maryland Aberdeen Proving Grounds Army facility there in Maryland. And I hope it's still there. I've not ever seen it, but I've read about it. It's armor-plated, dual rear wheels, really customized for the general. We also bought a number of them for just staff cars for regular officers. So it just tells you that they were well thought of to get that contract. Here we're at the back of the car. You see there's plenty of room for this trunk. Here's the center of the axle. The back seat is just a little bit forward, so it's easy to imagine a body coming on back through here. Here we have the Westinghouse air shocks on the back also, and dual mount spares ready to go on in case you need to have tire trouble. Tire trouble was a major issue in the early years. The tire quality, construction just wasn't there for durability, and hot days they'd come apart. And so tire technology started to develop pretty fast by this time on, but the early years, you went on a tour or a trip, you just planned on having several tire changing operations. New
Right.
tube or whatever. The stems would pull out of the tubes. You name it, that happened. But that was just part of the growing up process, and tires obviously have come a great distance. This was for your supplies, your picnic supplies, whatever you wanted to carry along in this trunk. Here we're looking at the back of a 1920 Pierce Arrow, high quality, high-end car again, as the Locomobile. Here we're looking at those Westinghouse Shocks again. Again, there's a very popular item on the higher priced cars. That big tank there's your gas tank, holds about 30-some gallons, I believe. You can see two pipes coming into it. They got the gas transferred from back here to the carburetor by air pressure. About 2 to 3 pounds of air is all you need to push the gas to the carburetor. Mm-hmm. Any more than that, you might override the float valve in the carburetor. So you run around 2.5 pounds. And they have little pumps, valve actuated pumps usually, but we found on a hot day just the sloshing of the gas back there will keep pressure at 2 to 3 pounds. And so a very dependable system. You didn't have anything much go wrong with it. Pierce was more well known than the Locomobile, equal quality, if not maybe a little better. But nothing wrong with either one of them. I want to move down the side here, Ike. This car has dual spares, one on each side, dual mounted into the fender well, which made it convenient. It didn't tie up the back end here like the Locomobile. They're probably cleaner because they were up here not in the dirt and dust of the back of the car. This is a 5-passenger touring. Called this body style, that we've been told, is the Western Pierce, has a solid front seat. The traditional Pierce Arrows have a bucket seats with a little walkway between where you can slip through, or children can anyway. Mm-hmm. The dashboard, of course, everything else in the car is the same. Very fun car to drive. The same bore and stroke as the Locomobile, now I think about it, 4.5 by 5.5. 4-speed transmission, and this car is a real performer. This is the most powerful car in the collection. The engine was built for 2 years, 1919 and 1920. It's what they call their dual valve, dual ignition. In other words, you've got 4 valves per cylinder, 2 exhaust, 2 intake, and you have a 2-spark, a dual distributor that had 2 independent systems coming off of that, firing plugs on either side of the piston. And it has a domed head, so the Hemi wasn't first. Pretty well what I understand about the Hemi that Chrysler likes to tout is in this engine. The valves are canted, they come in on a cant, a domed head and a domed piston. So that's a Hemi head to me.
Right. I noticed at top speed there's 70 miles an hour. That's quite fast for 1920.
Yeah, and this car will probably exceed that a little bit. It has a 4-speed transmission, and it's a real hill climber and accelerates quickly. I'd take a peek at the engine here briefly. Another thing, this is the Pierce trademark. I think they started this about 1910 or 11, incorporating the headlight into the front fender. So you see one of these coming at you, there was no question what the car was. It was a Pierce Arrow. Very popular with Woodrow Wilson, the president. He had a fleet of these that he rode around with. The pictures, lots of pictures of him around 1918, 1920, and he's always in a Pierce. That brings to mind a more recent president, John F. Kennedy, was almost always seen in a Lincoln Continental.
Yeah.
And this is again a T-head. It's the engine pairs of cylinders are cast in block, and removable heads, which was an innovation. The early ones did not have a removable head. You had to work on the engine. You had to pull the whole cylinder heads off to get to the piston rings or the valves. The 2 valves down in there, you probably can't see them, but To get the air capacity through the car, they went with 2 smaller valves instead of 1 big valve. You get into real big valves, you get into a problem with warping and heat and have valve trouble. So they solved that problem by going to 2 smaller valves. So today an overhead cam, dual cam engines are quite common, but that was just starting to come into being, this dual valve idea about this time. I don't know why they only made the engine 2 years. Maybe it was too costly, but they made them in 2 different horsepower sizes, but these are runners. It's amazing the acceleration and torque this engine has. You can go over Pikes Peak in high gear and never shift.
Wow.
And if you get behind a modern car that's looking at the elk, you can, if you're going 4 or 5 miles an hour, you can still stay in high gear and retard the spark and just go around and around him and accelerate. It's really quite impressive. The car is never heated, never had any trouble that way. It's been on Pikes Peak twice, and Trail Ridge, obviously, and any other hill we can find.
Is this electric starter?
It is. Yeah, they probably went to that about 1914. Here we have a 1916 Stutz Bulldog Special. And that meant that it was a 10 inches longer wheelbase than the Bearcat or their standard Bulldog. Gave you another foot of leg room in here and a longer wheelbase, of course. There's not too many Bulldogs or Bulldog Specials still in existence. I have a feeling that some of them were converted into Stutz Bearcats because they are a very highly valued car today. And it's not that big a job. The fenders are correct. The steering column angle is correct. So you take this body off, throw it away, and put your bucket seats and a gas tank back here, and you have, voila, a Stutz Bearcat. Same engine, same transmission, identical car. So if you're not an expert, you probably can't pick it out, and how well the individual who did the body work was. I purchased this car in Phoenix about 1977, I think it was. And it originally came out of Dodge City, Kansas. And the man had it there. After he died, his wife sold the car. Dad and I went down and picked it up, and drove it on the truck, and brought it home. And it's been on a couple of tours. One tour, I remember we were with the Pierce in this car together, and we had a great time. Like I said, it's the same engine as the Bearcat, the 4-cylinder T-head. Figures out about 390 cubic inches, which is pretty good displacement for a car this weight. And obviously, the Stutz racing record and stuff is indisputable. It's a matter of record. It has a dual spark mag, 2 sets of spark plugs, so you're firing both sides, getting the most out of your fuel charge you can. Again, here's another motometer. I believe the Pierce had one too. Yes, it did, for you failed to mention it. Popular item. If it wasn't factory equipment, people soon drilled the factory cap and installed one, because it's just a must for you to know where your engine was on operating temperature.
It's a fascinating looking motor.
Again, the T-head design, which was the most popular, one of the most popular for the higher end cars. It seemed like the exhaust heat got away quicker. You didn't have heating issues, and they breathed well, and so they hence performed. This is a spotlight. Here you can pivot to shine on the porch or whatever you're looking for, I guess. So another accessory item, quite popular. This car is a 1916 Packard. This was the first V12 built in this country, probably the world. And Packard introduced the V12 in late 1915. Some people call this a 15. It was actually built in September of 15, but I believe it's a 16 model. The car was from a farm near Greeley. Was found in a potato cellar, and this potato cellar was big enough they drove the trucks down into it and stored the potatoes during the winter and sold them as needed. This car was in the back of that cellar, covered with burlap sacks, and it amazes me the mice didn't bother it. This is the original upholstery in the car. It's still soft, it's luxurious. You won't find anything finer. This car retailed for $2,600, and I believe that was an introductory offer because of the entering the V12 era. They thought the customers might be leery of it, so they almost cut the price in half. The big six-cylinder Packard of 1915 was over $5,000. So the factory had to be losing money on every one of these they put out, because in 1917 that was a different price, much higher. But they became quite popular, and they sold a lot of them. So it was a good move to get them out the door and get people used to the car and buying them and talking about them, because the way went the sales. This rear wheel, I just stand here looking at it, heavy-duty wood wheel, looks like an artillery wheel on a real heavy vehicle. The vehicle is heavy, but it's not that heavy. It's just a massive wheel. Left-hand drive and left-hand control. I'll raise the hood here. This engine was designed by a man named Jesse Vincent, who later went on and built the V12 Liberty engines that used in World War I extensively in many different airplanes, and I believe watercraft. But it was this engine, just a little larger. 60-degree bank. It's only about a 3-inch bore and 5-inch stroke, so I think it figures out about 400 cubic inches, maybe just under. But high speed for the time. This engine's turning twice the RPM of these Big Sixes that we're looking at in the Lozier and the Pierce. And so it was another breakthrough, a trend toward the V8s and V12s. I don't remember a V6 at this time, but probably did it. It has a dual distributor mounted up front here, 6 plugs coming for this bank, 6 for the opposite bank. The carburetor's nestled down in the V. The one issue they did have, and they probably discovered it early on, was they didn't have enough cooling capacity. And this car will heat occasionally. And I think they knew it because the fan is a one-piece cast aluminum fan, and it's geared up, and that whines. And you can always tell a V12 Packard if you hear one coming by the sound of that fan. Very distinctive whine to them. Not unpleasant, I like it, but more or less a trademark, I guess. Again, you've got the red center on the hubcap, another Packard trademark. Low mileage car, very tight, and again, that condition of that upholstery says a lot. You know the car was never abused, it's always taken care of. Like what we're looking at here now is a brace of Model A's. We'll start with this one first. This is a sedan. My brother and my father restored this car, took the body off, did a frame up, I guess you'd call it. And my brother drove it to Longmont High School for about 1.5 years, maybe almost 2 years. He was pretty careful with it because there's a few dings on it, but not many for a high school car. My dad took it on a tour in Minnesota later on, and so my brother has a lot of good memories associated with that car. A typical Model A, dependable, start in the cold. I think Mike said at noon or at the end of the day in the cold weather, the old Model A kicked over, and some of the modern cars with their kids were having trouble having the jump cars. So they were definitely a success. The Model A was brought out, I believe, in October of 1928. Ford had ceased production for 6 months or so on the Model T, and it was a big, well-kept secret what the Model A was going to be like and what it would look like. I guess they had quite a few pre-orders. One of those numbers I've read is up to 500,000 people put deposits down on the new Ford without ever seeing one or knowing what they were going to get or what the price was going to be. And opening day, and my father talked about it, the memory of his, you know, it was a big deal to go to the Ford town, the Ford garage, to see the unveiling of the new Model A. They built the car, I believe, for about 4 years, and then the V8s came out in 32, I believe it was. So I forget the production on it, but they sold a lot of them. Kept Ford in the lead, I believe, in production. And then the V8 Ford took off with big success also. This one I'm standing in front of is a 1929 Roadster, just a different body style. I bought this car off a farm in Kansas. It was on a farm near Colby, Kansas. And I haven't done anything to it but drive it a little. It's completely original. The paint, everything's never been touched. And over the years, we've had a lot of people working on one come here to see how to do something, what the original looked like. And given that, I probably never do anything to it because just leave it original. It has a certain value from being that standpoint, from being original. This one is similar to the rumble seat. This one just has a trunk space, doesn't have the rumble seat, but I'm sure if you had the components, it wouldn't be much of a job to make it a rumble seat Roadster. Mm-hmm. The Model A Club today is quite popular, a lot of activities, and like I said, most of these cars have a club in support now. Stutz, Pierce, you name it. There's a group of owners got together and formed a club, and it's very helpful to find parts and exchange ideas, and they have their meets and their tours, and I think there's a tracker club that visited the museum a couple years ago, so even the modern cars have clubs. I was surprised to know that, but people came from all over the country to that meet. And so it's a social thing, I think. People, any excuse to get together and meet friends and get to know people across the country. That's been the big thing with these clubs. My parents really enjoyed their time with the Horseless Carriage Club and the other clubs, and they had friends all over the country as a result of that. And it may be a little unique with the car clubs or anything like that. The people come from all walks of life, and when they're together, they're only concerned with the hobby, and they forget their daily grind, and what some person does is not much consequence. They're just there to have a good time.
Right.
The car you're standing next to now is a circa 1928 Detroit Electric, another electric car. This car came out of Denver. It was owned by Mrs. Fonches. Some of the people who lived in the area for many years might remember the Fonches shoe store in downtown Denver. She drove this car to work every day. She was a presence in her store. And the last sticker on the windshield is the second 6 months of 1946. At that time, and much years later, Colorado had a twice a year inspection period. You had to go to a garage and get your brakes checked and a few things, exhaust system. So you had to get a sticker on your windshield. And again, I think she was in her mid-80s and she was still driving this car on the streets of Denver. My dad purchased it shortly after that when she gave up driving. It's, I believe, 84 volts. The front and back compartments hold batteries. We have the charger over in the other garage. It was quite an affair. Mercury arc rectifier, I believe is what they called it. And you got all these dials and levers, and it's quite a little process to get it fired up. But, that's what you use to charge your batteries overnight. You didn't just plug it into the socket on the wall. Very typical era body style of the time for the electrics. Again, very popular with the ladies, as Mrs. Fonches bears out. You open that door, if you would please. I don't know whether you can see it, but it's also a tiller steering system similar to the little 1908 Waverly. That folds down once you're seated. Both of them do. That short one is your throttle, and the long one is your steering mechanism. So you steer with your right hand, your left hand on the throttle. It's just a coordinated effort. And my mother used to drive this car in the parades, Boulder County Fair parades. Side note, the parades in 1946, Longmont was, I believe, was celebrating their 75th anniversary. And my father had 12 of his 13 cars, I believe, was in his collection in that parade. He got volunteers to come drive them, and it was quite an effort, but something he really enjoyed doing. What we've got here is a 1917 Studebaker 3-passenger Roadster. This is the same year as the Big Six we looked at earlier. This engine is the same bore and stroke, same cylinder design. It's just 2 less cylinders. It's a 4-cylinder instead of the 6. And for the lightweight of the car, it's a pretty good performer. I can remember riding in this car as a child And I remember seeing pictures of me as a small child riding in this car also. And it was one Dad kept around the farm just ready to go if he needed to run an errand or something on the farm. He'd jump in this car and go. He looked for any excuse to justify using one or have an excuse to drive it. So behind you is another Studebaker. This is a 1928 President. They had several models. The President was the high end of the line. And it might have been the first year for the big straight 8. And you see, yeah, I point out it's an 8-cylinder, which was not a novelty, but it was one of the new things. And there's the upper end of the price range. The upper models had the big 8s. Very good performing car. It's amazingly how well it drove. I was surprised. We got this car out of Gordon, Nebraska, and it was running and drove it on the truck and brought it home, and I haven't touched the motor. It's very fine quality inside, and you might note the belted paint job, the trim, and I believe it has 4-wheel brakes. Yes, it does. That came in about 1924. Buick car next door to it is a 24 Buick. That was the first year they had 4-wheel brakes. Another big jump in stopping power, and as the cars became faster and more traffic, you needed that. This engine was, Pure Cero quit about this time, and there was some overlap in the engines, and some of these same engines were used in Pierce's or vice versa. But anyway, whatever it is, it's a good engine. Here we have another local car. This is a 1924 Buick Big Six. Came out of Lafayette. I believe the sheriff had this car. And your hands on the climber spotlight there that he might have used in, I don't know if it was his duty car, but if he was a backup, he could shine that around to see the porches or whatever he was looking for.
Notice it has a pistol grip handle on it.
Floyd Clymer had his start in Berthoud, and he invented that spotlight, and he sold a lot of them. I'm sure he did very well financially. A lot of people bought those, cut the windshield to accommodate it, and away they went. Very low mileage car, all original. Nothing's been done to this car. Original paint, striping, top, upholstery. I think it had like 6,000 miles on it when my dad got it. He put 2,000 or 3,000 on it. He had a farm out at Kingsburg, and he used to commute daily back and forth with this car. Again, any excuse to drive one of the old cars. Been a number of years since we've run it, but it was sure a good performer the last time we did have it out. Buick brought out, I believe in 1924, the 4-wheel brakes. So the first time you had brakes on the front wheels as well as the rear. And probably doubled your stopping capacity, shortened the distances. And from then on, everybody had to have 4-wheel brakes pretty quickly.
It's interesting how an innovation in one manufacturer would catch on and spread to the others, like you said, very quickly.
Yeah, you had to keep up at the times. You better adapt it pretty quick. So, and it was a necessary feature. It wasn't just some add-on frill. Another car that people come to look at to want to see what an original one looks like.
I know they were competitive, but it seems like on some issues they were also cooperative.
I believe that's true. And there was a lot of moving, as today, people from one corporation to another. And it was strange how the models would come out the same year, had a lot of resemblance. I believe this is, I'm probably getting on thin ice here, but this radiator design looks very like a Packard. And I think Packard sued Buick for infringement there on that and won, I believe. So that's a matter of history, but I believe that's what I recall.
There goes the cooperation.
Yeah. Exactly. Again, this car, some of the others point out it's got a nice nickel-plated cap. I say nickel. Chrome hadn't come in yet, so this stuff that looks like chrome is nickel plate. And that comes off in a regular crank hookup if for some reason your starter's failing or your battery's low, you could crank these cars as backup. I don't know when that went away, but I know I have a 49 International truck down at the farm, and you can still crank it if you need to. Here's a Model T pickup, the 1926 version, shortly before they quit building the Model T. This car was donated to the collection by Mr. Losey. He used to have the S&F Alignment Company here in Longmont for many years. We're very appreciative of his donating to the collection, and we have a number of pieces in here that have been donated to the collection since we became a 501c3 foundation. People can get the cars appraised and get a deduction on their taxes, just like a gift to anything that qualifies for that. So it's the pickups are a little bit rare. Didn't make a lot of them, but a lot of people made their own pickup. They'd cut the touring car body off and build their own box. Mm-hmm. But I believe this is a Ford box. So, very utilitarian vehicle. I mean, people used these and used them hard. But typical Model T fashion, they held up. We were talking a little bit earlier off camera about the toughness of the vanadium steel axles in Fords and things that he went to that additive in steel. I know meteorologists. I don't know my metals, but I know it's, by adding the vanadium, it was a strengthener, and it's lightweight and thin, but yet didn't break. So another one of Ford's ideas to get the quality but lightweight. It's amazing some of the old-time movies you'll see of these Model Ts and other cars on the roads that they were driving on and what they did with them. It's just, for two-wheel drive, you'd swear they were four-wheel drive, some of the tricks they were doing up and down hills and things. But maybe it was just for the camera for the movie, but it didn't turn out too well. But the clip you see, it really looks good.
While this concludes Doug Dougherty's video tour of the automobiles in the Dougherty Museum, there are antique trucks, agricultural equipment, antique organs, and pianos, which you can view when you visit.